Hey everyone, you are listening to another episode of the All Things Private Practice podcast. I'm your host, Patrick.Casale. I'm joined today by a good friend of mine and colleague, Debi Frankle. She is a grief nerd, as she likes to label it, LMFT out in California, all things grief, really, really wonderful human being. And today we're going to talk about a really interesting topic, which is the misdiagnosis of grief when ADHD is prevalent. So, Debi, thank you for so much for coming on. I know we've been trying to do this for a while, and I'm really happy to have you here.
I am really, really happy to be here. Really. I love your podcast. Oh my gosh, I was just listening to the one about HIPAA, and that was really, really good information.
Thank you. Yeah, I have to give major props to Lyeth Dalton of Person Centered Tech because,
Yeah.
wow, what a wealth of knowledge. I came away feeling like I learned so much. I also came away feeling like, oh shit, am I not doing things the right way? But I appreciate that. So
Yeah.
tell me a little bit about, I know you moderate the Facebook group for private practice grief. I know you're very heavily involved in the grief community. You're definitely, you and Jill Johnson Young are my two like
Yep.
go-tos whenever grief comes up. I'm like, talk to Debi, talk to Jill.
Yes.
And I think that is so crucial
Yeah.
in this profession. But you floated the topic about grief and ADHD, and I'm just curious about
Yep.
the why and what feels really important for you to hit on when we talk about both of those things.
Okay. So, I'm going to start with the why, is um, because I have ADHD, and which actually was not even a diagnosis in the mid '60s, when my sister died. So my mom and dad, my mom was exposed to rubella in the mid '60s, and while she was pregnant with my sister, and my sister died. I mean, at 4 days old. So it was I was 7, and I was 7, 6 to 8 is such a precarious, developmental stage for kids, because all of a sudden they understand permanence and the seriousness of stuff. Um, and so my parents in the mid '60s, there were no grief support groups. There was no, it was you move on and we don't talk about it. And they didn't get any support that they needed. Um, and so the reason why I wanted to do this topic is because when I looked back at that time, you know, is my parents are really good about telling me what happened, but then after that, it was we don't go there, we don't, we don't talk about what happened. And within a year and a half, I was needing speech therapy. I actually, my fourth grade teacher wanted to hold me back. I had to be, I was in special classes in fifth and sixth grade. And in sixth grade, I was with special class with 2 other girls and 11 boys. So you tell me that that wasn't an ADHD group and class. And but nobody was talking about or looking at how did the whole grief in the family play out. And so that's why, I think that there's a lot of grief with having ADHD, and all that we miss out on. But I also think and know that there are too many kids that I've worked with who come in I remember one boy who would just had a lot of hyperactivity. So a lot of fidgety, a lot of bounce. Well, his dad had died from suicide, and mom wanted to protect the kids and didn't tell them. And so it comes out, I think, where the ADHD symptoms end up getting exacerbated. And then we end up focusing on that without really doing a whole loss history of what's been going on. And loss history, I mean, doing that, asking about losses that happen, not just like, oh, well, what happened the last 6 months or even a year? It's like, do a whole loss history, because that stuff comes up over and over again later on. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I think it's something that probably a lot of people right now are listening to and thinking like I've never put the correlation between ADHD and grief and loss, and
Mhm.
how grief and loss symptoms can certainly exacerbate or show up as intensified ADHD symptoms, especially in young kids and young adolescents, where everyone's always assessing behavior and everyone's always assessing attention and the ability to focus, and there
Mhm.
could be so much disruption behind the scenes that we're not even thinking about, because maybe when you were a young child you did have a significant loss, or maybe it was a divorce in the family, or maybe it was, whatever, a pet loss or anything that felt really traumatic and significant. And
Yeah,
we all know like the grief process is typically not very linear, and it can just show up in ways where memories, senses, scents, environments, like sounds can really start triggering certain reactions. So
absolutely.
I think this is a very interesting topic, and honestly, one that I have never really thought about much before.
Yeah, it's one that I see a lot. I'll even uh, there's another case that I had done a psychosocial history on a woman who had come into I worked in patient hospitals for many, many years. And woman had gotten admitted because had a psychotic break, thought that she was 4 years old. She was actually in her early 80s, I think. And when I was able to get some history from one of her siblings, he had told me, well, when she was 5, their mom had died. This was in the this was in the 1920s. And so they all the kids ended up in an orphanage because dad couldn't take care of them. Well, she had 4 brothers. They all ended up at one orphanage. Ended up at another one at 5. And so it was like, well, then the symptomology makes so much more sense as well. Why wouldn't she want to believe that she's 4? And so, we look at, people go, well, that's pathological grief. It's like, I don't think that's pathological. It makes so much more sense of of the symptomology with the loss, and the hopes and the dreams and the expectations that come along with that. So, I think again, I really, really want to be able to share the importance of doing a really good loss history, um, so that we can start identifying that, so we can even look at the whole entire family system, that of how everybody reacted to the loss, and kids and adults with ADHD do that much more behaviorally, or, get fragmented or have a really hard time concentrating and paying attention, which is a really common sign of grief, is that people have a hard time concentrating. They have a hard time paying attention. Well, that just exacerbates all of all of the uh, say symptoms of attention disorder. Anyway,
Yeah,
yeah,
there's a lot of overlap. So it's really tricky, right? So if you don't suss
huge.
it out and you don't assess for it really
Mhm.
intentionally and thoroughly, it's really easy to mislabel or misidentify something. And if we're talking about ADHD, which is a neurodevelopmental disorder, which is a lifelong disorder and disabling condition for a lot of people, we want to get it right. And we want to also be able to suss out like what is what so we can treat things appropriately. So,
Mhm.
what are common symptoms and traits that you would see, as a young kid or adolescent or even young adult who is ADHD, who has an ADHD profile, but also has a significant grief history? What types of correlations are we looking for here?
A really good idea. Yeah, it's really good. Um, is I think having a really hard time, and not just concentrating, but with tolerate frustration tolerance is um, not being able to, um, not being able to wait, not being able to, it's the tolerance of other people are doing and saying stupid things, and, and we don't like them and they're snappy, but grievers are really snappy and irritable. Okay. Is that the world feels really different when you've had a really significant loss. And so, they start noticing that the stuff that seemed important isn't important anymore. And now the stuff that seems really insignificant is what other people are talking about. And if you have a hard time in the first place being able to tolerate or read social cues, then it's going to be even more of a problem.
Yeah. So you're going to
Yeah.
see more interrupting. You're going to see more frustration. Maybe you're going to be more blunt and direct in your communication. I imagine coming off as rude or dismissive or like you don't care about what the other person is saying. And in
Yes,
reality, it's like my distress tolerance is significantly diminished because I'm living in an altered state of my reality where things are just not the same anymore.
exactly. And so you've also just described grievers whose uh, uh, we'll take the example of loss of a loved one. All of a sudden, their loved one isn't there, and people are saying things that are not helpful at all. Like, they're in a better place, and well, at least they're not suffering anymore. And so it's hard to even just tolerate that. And then if you have a hard time with that in the first place, it's going to feel even more torturous. Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. So I think it sounds like trying to link a correlation and connection between impulse control, the ability to regulate emotions and reactions, and then the reality of like things have shifted so drastically and I'm kind of becoming really not desensitized to the world, but quite cynical or callous in some ways when people are telling you things that are not useful. And I've had this conversation before on here when we talked about grief. Jill was one of the first people I had on the podcast.
Hmm.
We talked about like when people say they're in a better place or they offer whatever they can offer. So often it's because they're trying to almost comfort themselves by trying to say the appropriate thing without
Absolutely.
having the difficult conversation. And I think that's really challenging for people where it's almost like, how do I try to offer my condolences, but I don't know what to say? But when I do that, I end up saying the wrong thing and it's not actually hitting the mark. It's not actually landing.
Right. And and often, and Jill and I have talked about this a lot, often if people would just say, I have no idea what to say, that would be more true. And more people will tell me, I just wish people would either be truthful and say they don't know what to say, or just offer me a hug.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
for us to take a look at all the nonverbal ways that we communicate, and those are the ways that people will have a hard time being able to read those cues. That then it goes and gets uh, misunderstood even more. And so I often will talk about the head tilt is Alaska Griever. So have you gotten the head tilt yet?
Give us a visual example of what you mean by
Almost everybody knows what it's like. Oh,
that. Just so
and
everyone can see this.
oh, and it's that it's always interpreted as, oh, poor you.
Right.
I feel bad for you. I pity you. And when all of a sudden the world seems really, really different, then then it's even more confusing and we feel more helpless. And so then it's, oh, poor you, feels even ickier.
Yeah, it's almost minimizing in a lot of ways as if you don't really see me or you don't really understand the
Mhm,
struggle. And I think that happens a lot when we're talking about grief in all different ways. Like
mhm.
it could be a grief process around a diagnosis. When someone discovers, "Hey, I am ADHD. Hey,
Yep,
I am autistic. Hey, I have bipolar disorder. Hey, I have cancer." There's grief around that diagnosis. Um,
absolutely.
Grief around the loss of someone. We that's very clear.
Mhm.
Grief around life circumstances changing. Like I've even talked about grief around if you are actively addicted to something and then you've moved into a recovery space,
Yep.
although it sounds really bizarre and counterintuitive, there is still grief around the loss of people, places, and things that you became familiarized with. I know
Yep.
for my gambling addiction, like, am I happy I'm no longer gambling? Absolutely.
Mhm.
Do I sometimes have grief around like casinos that I can't go to, people I used to spend
Mhm.
time with, places I used to go on a regular basis? Sure. But that doesn't
Yeah.
mean that those emotions are not very complex and very nuanced.
I'm so glad you brought that up. It's actually something that I always include when I do trainings when we talk about different types of losses. And I'll always include here's this, I put it under disenfranchised grief of losses that are minimized or aren't seen, of wait a minute, what happens when somebody gets clean or sober? Okay. Or, isn't using whatever substance that they were using, whether that's gambling, whether it's food, whether it's gardening, it doesn't matter. And the loss of that, you know, the the thing that you go to make yourself feel better, that now I'm not using that anymore. And that's definitely has a whole bunch of uncomfortable feelings and sensations.
There's so much identity wrapped up in that too, where you lose
Yeah.
your identity in a lot of ways. I think that's a loss that we don't talk about very often.
Hmm.
Um, I often talk about on my other podcast with Megan, Dr. Megan Neff, the Divergent Conversation podcast, of
Yeah.
grief and relief of our adult autistic diagnoses, where we grieve our childhoods, which could have been different from a different lens. We have
Yes.
some relief in acknowledging this is why our realities are the way that they are.
Mhm.
But that is a complicated grief system that does not just go away because
No.
you're experiencing this you're experiencing these emotions, these reactions, these processes, these sensory overwhelm and overloads on a
Mhm.
daily basis, sometimes minute by minute. So
Mhm.
it's always in your face. It's just a matter of like, well, how are we going to work through this? How are we going to have acceptance over the grief that we're experiencing? And then
Mhm.
there's that existential grief too, of just the acknowledgement of like, life is forever altered as I know it. And I think that can be really, really complicated for people that have any sort of neurodivergence.
Absolutely. And when you talk about, identity, loss of identity is so interwoven in grieving experiences, in whatever loss is. What does that mean for me? How do other people see me? How do I see myself? How do I assume that other people see me? Yeah. I also like to think of, when somebody gets diagnosed, is that what was going on that led up to that diagnosis, and who did you have to talk to about it? I like to ask, who got you? Who got it? Often many people will say nobody did. Is that grief is so isolating, you know?
Yeah, it's
And then
isolating for sure.
yeah, and then how do we interpret the diagnosis? What does it say about us?
Absolutely. I think your sense of self can be really rocked when you have to process that if you feel like you're isolated and alone. I
Mhm.
also think that compounded or complex grief, or a consistent grief history, which I think is why it's so important to do a thorough inventory,
Mhm.
is you can then start to get misdiagnosed with maybe borderline personality disorder, complex PTSD. If you've experienced
Right.
X amount of trauma and your reaction to that trauma is presenting a certain way, reacting a certain way, experiencing life a certain way, it's very easy to get misdiagnosed with all sorts of things, which coincide with being misdiagnosed as ADHD or autistic. A lot of these things overlap, a lot of similarities,
Yes.
yet they're not the same. So I think it's very easy to get into this like almost this rabbit hole of like, what is it? You're on like WebMD Googling symptoms, and all of
Right.
a sudden you're diagnosed with everything under the sun. And ultimately, in reality, it's like we're not really thoroughly looking at different portions of life and different
Mhm.
contributing factors here either.
Yes. And with trauma work, Grief is knotted with trauma. And we have really, really great, wonderful interventions and therapies that are focused all on trauma. Um, and actually, I'm doing I do a course on untangling grief from trauma, because there's so much loss that often we don't ask about that other stuff, is that we don't talk about all of the loss of safety and trust, loss in our own identity. What does that mean? Yeah. There's also, a loss that will have a primary loss, and then we have a whole lot of secondary losses. So we have a loss of a parent due to death, divorce, addiction, estrangement. Then there's all these secondary loss of loss of who the other parent has been, because that other parent is not the same anymore either. You know, I know when I was a kid, my mom, after my sister died, my mom was just off. She would get more headaches. She'd get more backaches. I'd want to stay home and keep her company more. Now you look at loss of a parent of, loss of safety and trust. The 8-year-old who worried about who was going to get him to school on time after his mom's suicide. And that he wasn't really quite sure. In fact, he actually told dad, I'm a little, he's such a great kid. I'm a little worried, dad, because you've only been a dad. You haven't been a mom, and mom did a lot. Yeah. Changes in roles where a lot of oldest kids then take on extra chores, but I don't think it's always the oldest kids, by the way. It can be any of the other kids, is that all of their roles have changed. Look at loss of family structure and routines. There's often then financial strain or less contact with the other parent that's not there anymore, their family. There's change of families, or change of friends, maybe dropping out of activities that the other parent was involved in. So then you've got all of that with a kid who needs to have structure and needs to have the same stuff. Okay. Is that then that throws everything off. And then you're having more temper tantrums. Yeah.
Yeah. And then in school, you might be circling back, you might be getting misdiagnosed as either oppositionally defiant or
Right.
ADHD, or, there
Mhm.
might be behavioral issues at home. But again, circling back to the fact that a lot of times we're not assessing for grief. And a lot of times we are sticking to this very
Exactly.
black and white thinking when it comes to grief recovery, which is like, go through the stages and then voila, cured. And then it will never impact you again, which we know is bullshit.
Uh, uh, okay, I'm just going to put this out there because I know that there's a lot of people that listen to your podcast. So I'm going to take time to say, can we please do away with the stages that were appropriate and are appropriate for people who are dying? It's a different process, but the stages often end up, making people feel like they're crazy. The one consistent remark that I get, that we've gotten for 30 years in our counseling center, because we focus on grief, is there must be something wrong with me because I'm, I think I'm in, I accept it. I'm in acceptance. It's like, well, what does accept mean anyway? And especially if the loss is so unacceptable. So, it's the way that we language grief is so interwoven in how we deal so poorly with grief and pain.
It's a topic that I think society doesn't like to touch because it's
Oh,
uncomfortable.
right.
And if we can move from anger to denial to acceptance to,
Mhm.
whatever the stage is, all of a sudden it's like, well, how come this is not going in this like linear fashion? And how come I having moved from stage to stage in
Right.
an appropriate amount of time? And how come I keep circling back to anger? Or how come I keep
Right.
circling back to this? And it's just so complicated. I think it's just a
Mhm.
complicated topic that we so often just don't give space to. And
Yeah.
even for business owners that are listening, like there's grief around leaving a job. There's grief around
Absolutely.
starting a business. There's grief around shutting a business down.
Yep.
For those of you listening who are thinking, I don't know if I want to be a therapist anymore, there's grief around that process because that's
Absolutely.
identity woven and that comes with a whole bunch of shit. So
Yeah.
very complex and very dynamic. And I don't know if you can see the shirt I'm wearing right now, Debbie, but I'm wearing a Anthony Bourdain shirt that my wife
Yeah.
got me yesterday.
Yep. I
And
love
just
it.
so my brain can diverge real quickly, when Debbie and I were at a conference in Hawaii a few years ago, I stupidly went to see this Anthony Bourdain movie with a bunch of grief therapists,
I
Debbie and Jill
remember.
included,
Yeah.
and experienced an enormous amount of grief while watching that movie.
Yeah.
And what better space to be than Hawaii with two wonderful grief therapists? And but in reality, it was very challenging, and
Mhm.
I think that also helped me lead me to my own autistic diagnosis discovery because I felt like I related so much to Anthony Bourdain's story in so many ways, and I started doing more reading and assessing, and I was like, I think Anthony Bourdain was autistic. Like, I think all these things match up. And then all of a sudden, here's my diagnosis a couple of years later, and I'm like, oh shit, like Anthony Bourdain has become a special interest of mine. So it's
Yeah.
very fascinating. But nevertheless, grief is one of those things. And I think that you can have grief around celebrity losses that you've never met, that you've never had any contact with. When people's favorite singers die, when people's favorite actors or actresses die, it impacts you, especially for neurodivergent folks who have these feelings of special interest around songs or
Mhm.
um, shows or movies or music or something that has
Meaning
really
to
been
them.
moving.
Yep.
So it's just very, very complicated.
You bring up a really good point is that I think that when we get new information, um, then we have to go back and and look at the whole puzzle all over again. It's like when I've had kids who or adults who have found out this piece of, oh wow, wait a minute, it wasn't an accident. My parent was murdered, or my parent was died by suicide. And then you have to go back. I remember a dad after one of his kids had found out that his wife had died by suicide, and he was upset that his kid all of a sudden was starting to act out and was getting a little more mouthy, so to speak. Until I was like, wait a minute, hold on, but his mom just died. And he was like, no, that was 2 years ago. I said, no, he just got new information, which means that you got to go through the whole history all over again. It's like, wait a minute, I thought I had the whole puzzle all finished. Now I find out there's all these key pieces that now I got to redo the whole thing. And then how exhausting that is.
Yeah. Yeah. You may have moved through your acceptance phase or whatever the case may be and tidied that up and put that away and compartmentalized it. And all of a sudden you have to unlock everything again and reassess it and look at it from a different perspective. And that comes with newfound information and newfound emotion too. So this is
Right.
a very complex topic. And I'm glad to know that you and Jill and other people out there are just doing some phenomenal work, having very difficult conversations with people on sensitive subjects that are really impactful. And I think that it's really important to just continue to talk about and continue to address. So I just want to thank you for coming on and sharing your
Thank
perspective
you.
on this, especially around a topic that is so taboo for so many people.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you. I really, really appreciate the opportunity to be able to come and share some of this information with people, which I just think is so, it's just a part of our life.
It
It's
is,
great.
and it's an important one to really lay eyes on and have conversations around. So thank you so much, Debbie, and just share with the audience where they can find more of what you've got going on and where they can reach you.
Come on over to privatepracticegrief.com. And I've got actually a course coming up in the end of July, and I've got another one on untangling grief and trauma. It's a 4-week course. I love this. I love doing this course because it's I also include prolonged grief disorder, which we can do a whole another podcast on prolonged grief disorder. But I have a whole training for that so that people can really take a look at what is it and what it isn't. Um, and so that's in the end of July. And then I've got in September, I'm actually doing my annual grief skills 6-week, really, really deep dive. So you really want to learn about how to deal with grief. Come join me in September. So privatepracticegrief.com. I also have my Facebook group, Private Practice Grief, for clinicians, health and professionals who want more information and want to talk about grief, because I'm a nerd and I love talking about grief.
Love it. All of that information will be in the show notes so that all of you have easy access to all of Debi's information and upcoming courses. Debi, thanks so much for coming on, and hope to see you
Thanks.
on top of another Hawaiian mountaintop sometime soon.
Yeah. Thanks.
To everyone listening to the All Things Private Practice podcast, new episodes are out every single Saturday on all major podcast platforms and YouTube. Like, download, subscribe, and share. Doubt yourself. Do it anyway. See you next week.